Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're marching straight into, well, the world of ancient warfare.
Indeed.
And our guide is Harry Sidebottom's fantastic book, Ancient Warfare, a very short introduction.
A very sharp book, yeah.
It really is. I know many listeners were curious about getting past the Hollywood version of these battles. So our mission here, to kind of cut through some common ideas about ancient warfare, get a bit more nuance.
And Sidebottom gives us a great starting point, doesn't he? He uses that scene from Gladiator.
Ah, yes, the opening battle.
Exactly. That image of the, super disciplined Romans against the, what looks like a chaotic barbarian horde.
It immediately sets up that contrast, that idea of West versus
Precisely.
others.
It taps right into this concept of particular way of fighting.
Okay, so let's dig into that. This idea, Sidebottom brings up the Western way of war. What's the traditional thinking there?
Well, traditionally, the Western way of war usually means things like open battles, decisive clashes, heavy infantry being key. Think Greek hoplites, Roman legionaries, lots of emphasis on courage, discipline, fighting shoulder to shoulder in formation.
Like a more rational, maybe more effective approach?
That's the underlying idea, yes. A sort of inherent superiority in method.
But Sidebottom, he doesn't just leave it there, does he? He starts questioning it pretty quickly.
Right away. He makes the case that while this Western way of war definitely existed as an ideology.
An ideology, meaning?
Meaning a set of beliefs, a way they like to think about war and themselves, their own superiority. But it wasn't always, the reality on the ground.
Ah, okay. So more of an ideal they aimed for, or how they presented themselves.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really key point he makes. This wasn't some, objective truth about warfare, but a narrative. Something constructed at a certain time for certain reasons.
That makes sense. It's about how identity gets built, even through conflict.
And how justifications are formed. It's relevant far beyond just ancient history.
So, if we're looking for the roots of this ideology, you might think Homer's Iliad would be the place to start. It's foundational.
That's the natural assumption, isn't it? You'd expect to see the civilized Greeks embodying this early Western way against the barbaric Trojans.
But that's not quite what Sidebottom finds.
Well, no, not really. He points out that when you actually dive into the Iliad, the lines are much blurrier, the Greeks and Trojans. They're actually quite similar in many ways.
Similar how? In fighting style?
In fighting style, yes, but also in their social structures, their weapons, even their values, The heroes act similarly. Their societies aren't fundamentally different.
So that simple us versus them dynamic isn't really there in Homer.
Not in the way you might expect. The Western way of war was already a fully formed concept back then. It really challenges that idea of ancient, deep roots for this specific ideology.
Okay, so if not in Homer, when does this distinct idea really start to take hold, according to Sidebottom?
He really pins it on the Persian Wars.
Early 5th century BC, the big clash between the Greek city-states and the Persian Empire.
Exactly. That was a massive conflict, and it forced the Greek cities to, unite in a way they hadn't before. And crucially, they started defining themselves against the Persians.
Defining themselves against the barbarian other.
Precisely. The Persians became the foil. The Greeks started emphasizing their way as different, superior. Things like freedom, the idea of the citizen soldier.
A hoplite phalanx, right.
Yeah.
Citizens arming themselves, fighting for their city.
Yes, that became central. They contrasted their tight formations and their civic duty with what they portrayed as the Persians' sort of mass armies composed of subjects fighting under servitude.
So the Western way of war narrative really gets going here as a cultural identity marker.
It really gains traction then. The idea of the disciplined Greek fighting for liberty against the disorganized barbarian horde that becomes a powerful story they tell about themselves.
It's amazing how conflict shapes culture so deeply. And Sidebottom goes further, right? He looks at how war seeped into everything.
Oh, absolutely. He shows it wasn't just battles. War influenced how they even defined culture itself. The whole civilized barbarian distinction. It shaped ideas about gender.
What it meant to be a man, presumably.
Definitely. And philosophy, political thinking, so much of it was tied up with or reacted to the realities and ideals of warfare.
It's interesting how those military values could underpin even things like philosophical concepts of virtue.
Yeah, it was deeply ingrained. Martial prowess and civic virtue were often linked.
And the actual practice of war wasn't static either, was it? It changed over time.
Sidebottom tracks that evolution clearly. From the hoplite phalanx, which dominated early Greek warfare,
Right.
to the Roman legions, which were much more flexible, professional, adaptable.
And things like cavalry became more important later on.
Increasingly so, yeah. So even the Western way of war, if we can call it that, wasn't one single thing. It adapted, it changed. Army structures often reflected social changes too.
And military success or failure could reshape political thinking.
Profoundly. Victories could justify political systems, defeats could force major rethinks.
So beneath this umbrella term, the reality was diverse. It wasn't all just lines of infantry smashing into each other.
Not at all. When Sidebottom gets into strategy and tactics, the picture becomes much richer. Logistics, for example.
Just getting the army there and keeping it supplied, hugely important but often overlooked.
Absolutely critical. And siege warfare, taking cities, that was a whole different ballgame. Required engineering, patience, resources. Think about famous sieges.
Like Syracuse or Alesia.
Exactly. Complex operations. And then there's naval power. You can't forget that, especially in the Mediterranean.
Controlling the sea lanes, projecting power, crucial for empires like Athens or Rome.
Definitely. Think of battles like Salamis.
Camillus.
Decisive. So ancient commanders needed a whole toolbox of strategies.
It wasn't just about having the bravest soldiers. Skill, planning, adaptation were key.
Precisely. Sidebottom emphasizes that variety. Commanders had to think about terrain, enemy strengths, their own weaknesses, using deception, flanking maneuvers, not just head-on assaults.
Okay, so pulling this all together, Sidebottom's main thrust is really to get us past that simple, maybe romanticized view of the Western way of war.
That's the core of it, yeah. He argues ancient warfare was far more complex, more dynamic than that single stereotype allows.
And he points out that these classical societies didn't always measure up to their own hype, so to speak.
Right. Their ideals about discipline, decisive battles weren't always met in practice. And interestingly, he notes that other cultures, those often labeled barbarians, sometimes used tactics that weren't actually that different.
So the lines blur again when you look closely.
They certainly do.
And this whole framework, these ancient ideas, they didn't just disappear, did they? They've had a long afterlife.
A very long one. Sidebottom touches on how these classical concepts about strategy, discipline, citizen soldiers, virtue, and war have been constantly debated, reinterpreted, and reused throughout Western history.
Influencing military thinkers and leaders for centuries.
Absolutely. Even today, consciously or not, the way we think about and organize for conflict often carries echoes of these ancient Greek and Roman ideas and narratives.
So the big takeaway from digging into Sidebottom here is really that critical lens, questioning those neat categories like the Western way of war.
Exactly. See it less as a fixed historical fact and more as a powerful, evolving ideology that tells us as much about the people who created it as it does about ancient warfare itself.
It's about seeing the complexity beyond the myth.
Precisely put.
This has been incredibly insightful, really makes you rethink those familiar images of ancient battles, and it leaves me pondering, and maybe leaves our listeners pondering too. How might our own modern understanding of conflict, maybe even the justifications we hear today, still be subtly shaped by these very old ideas about how wars are or should be fought? Something to think about.
Definitely something to consider.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.